All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us for June meetup. Sorry for the huge delay. I'm going to continue to try to see if I can fix the streaming thing when John gets started, but I make no guarantees. We're honored to have John, author of Laws of UX from O'Reilly, coming to speak, and I think this is going to be a pretty awesome talk. John's done a lot of amazing things, anything from the laws of UX to the field guide for web development. He's currently at General Motors. I think you'll really enjoy this. So the way that we're going to handle this is if you have any questions, just please type them in the chat, and I'll be monitoring the chat, and then I'll moderate the questions for John at the end. Before we get started, I usually just like to thank our sponsors and just to give a brief overview of some of the upcoming events. It'll only take a minute. So Varen Technologies is a larger defense contractor company in the Maryland area. Always looking for data scientists, software engineers, web developers, UX engineers. So if you're interested in learning more, please reach out to me. Clarity Business Solutions is another defense contracting company, a little smaller, but again, they're also looking for sharp individuals. They've been helping with the meetup for years. So if you're interested, please reach out to me. ICF is a much larger company. They have around 7,000 folks. They support a range of customers in Virginia, Maryland, and other areas. I think they do some work that's beyond government contracting. So if you're interested in seeing what opportunities they have, please reach out. And then Areas Ventures is my company. We're very small in the Maryland area doing defense contracting, data scientists, analytic developers. So if you're interested in learning more about that company, of course, reach out to me. And then we've posted the next two meetups. One's going to feature some students from Loyola, Maryland, talking about some of the projects that they've worked on. So you can get to see some of the next generation of data scientists. And in July, it's more of a how to automate Splunk using a range of tools from like Terraform to Ansible to Amazon Web Services. So it's pretty interesting how they did it, or how they were able to set it up and really able to spin up new instances very quickly for their engineers. We have a newsletter, goes out every month. There's a new website. If you're interested, just go to dataworksmd.org, where everything kind of comes together. If you have any suggestions, always reach out and let me know. And again, like with that, I'm about to hand over to John. I'm very honored to have him and very happy. We met through the O'Reilly, and I looked at a lot of his stuff, which is amazing work. I think everyone's going to be thoroughly impressed. So with that, I'm going to let John share his screen and take over.
All right. Can everyone see my screen?
Not yet, John.
Oh, sorry. I should start sharing first. Okay, how about now?
Not yet.
Oh, it says host disabled attendee screen sharing.
You should be. No. Do it now. You weren't listed as co-host. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Now you should do it.
All right. Excellent. Well, so you should be able to see my screen now. Thank you everyone for having me today. My name's Jon Yablonski, and I'm really excited to kind of talk about a book I just published with O'Reilly, which Jason had just mentioned, called Laws of UX. And I'll kind of go into, from a high level, what the book is about, but also kind of the, what I was kind of attempting to really address throughout the book, and also, relate that back to this group, particularly in terms of data. So a little bit more about me. I'm a multidisciplinary designer, speaker, writer, and digital creator. I am based in the greater Detroit area. And I'm currently working on the next generation of in-vehicle interactive experiences as a product designer at General Motors. So the book, it's subtitled Using Psychology to Design Better Products and Services. And really the objective of this book was really to make these psychology concepts a lot more accessible for not just UX designers like myself, but also, technologists in general, and even in developers as well. So it really kind of starts off and kind of gives an overview of these key principles and heuristics, and really goes into the origins and then really practical application. The book's available in all kinds of places. One of my favorite online retailers is Bookshop. They actually donate proceeds to local bookstores, which is amazing. But you can also find it in places like Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And the book really was kind of like this evolution of a website I created called Laws of UX. And oddly, and I talk a little bit about this in the preface, but it started off, this project in general started off with a automotive project that I had started on, and came into it kind of as an outsider with very little data to work off of. And, I think anyone that's working in technology really depends on data to do a lot for them. In my case, it was behavioral data and what would inform my design decisions. And there wasn't a lot available, so I had to kind of look for this in other places. And what I found was that for technologists, there's this really deep field of psychology where there's a lot of really great history of psychological kind of studies and how they inform the work that we do as technologists. And when I found this, it really kind of helped fill in the gaps that I couldn't use when it comes to data, and really found that it helped me a lot, and I learned a lot in the process. Also realized that there was kind of a need for a resource that I was looking for, because when it comes to psychology, a lot of this content was hard to kind of decipher. It was, in academic papers that didn't directly correlate to digital products or services. So there was a translation involved. And so I decided to kind of, create that resource that I was looking for online. And those are the origins of Laws of UX. That led to the book. And here's a kind of a high-level overview of the book. By no means a comprehensive collection of all the possible heuristics that are valuable from psychology, but these are definitely the ones that I've identified as really important, very relatable, especially for UX designers. And we'll talk about a few of these. I'll talk about a few of these in this talk. I'll also kind of tie that up at the end, circle back to, practical application of this in your everyday workflow, and then also kind of the ethical element of using psychology, because I think it's important when you're considering how psychology can kind of build more human-centered products and services. It can also be used to kind of shape behavior in negative ways as well. The first one I want to talk about is Jacob's Law. And I start the book off with Jacob's Law for a very good reason. It's because that it has this all-comprehensive kind of effect on all the work that we do as technologists, right? So Jacob's Law states that users spend most of their time on other sites. And this means that users prefer your site to work the same way as other sites that they already know. This was kind of, coined by Jakob Nielsen in 2000. And it very much was, geared toward the web and the internet, which was kind of exploding at the time and growing. But I think this also can apply to apps and, intranets. It can really apply to any digital service or product. And each chapter in the book, I really try to kind of relate this back to very explicit examples that we see in the digital space. And I start Jacob's Law off by talking about this concept of mental models, and that, the way the human brain works is that we build a mental model or an idea, a blueprint of how something works based on previous experiences. And we actually bring that into our new experiences. So we're carrying over constantly this kind of past knowledge that we built. And when you think about that in relation to some of the things that we're all familiar with, for example, forms on the web, they directly correlate to, toggles and switches from this physical space. And I think that was very purposeful from a design standpoint, because we carry over the mental model that we have as human beings interacting with toggles, switches, and buttons into the digital space. And they function very similar, albeit, but in a digital capacity. So that's a really good example of like a mental model that's carried over from physical to digital space. Another great example of this is the top right example. It's actually seat controls. I believe this is a Mercedes vehicle. And they've actually mapped the seat controls in the shape of the seat. They could have easily mapped the controls just in a horizontal row of toggles, but they chose to map these controls in the shape of the seat so that it's a lot easier for occupants of the vehicle to know exactly what part of the seat they're going to manipulate when they're interacting with the seat control. And then, of course, the bottom right example is an e-commerce example. This one happens to be from, I believe, Etsy.com. But you can see that it follows these very similar patterns when it comes to e-commerce, where you have a shopping cart in the top right corner, and you have, you're basically adding items to a shopping cart, which is also a carryover from this mental model we have from shopping in the physical space and physically adding things to our shopping carts. And they carry that into e-commerce. And now you'll see that, by and large, e-commerce stores follow a very similar interaction model where you're, browsing for items, you add items to your cart, and then you check out the items from your cart. And last but not least is a good example of when, designing for how mental models work, you can actually kind of ease the transition for users from something that was a familiar experience to something that's new. I think Google has always done a really good job of this, and I show this example from YouTube where they underwent a pretty major redesign a couple years back, and what they actually let people do is opt into this new experience as opposed to flipping the switch and everyone gets the new YouTube overnight. I think this was really smart, because what it does is it kind of lowers that cognitive dissonance that happens when you just flip a switch on a new experience, and people can't really use their prior mental model in this new product or experience because it's very unfamiliar. And then for each chapter in the book, I tried to really kind of hone in on, from a user experience standpoint, what would be an exercise that we could use that would help kind of relate back to Jacob's Law. And I think Jacob's Law really lends itself really well to user personas, right? So user personas are great because they frame the reference for who the users actually are. And it helps kind of move team members away from this self-referential, thinking and focus on the needs of the actual user and their goals. And this helps for prioritizing features, because a lot of times you can, for a product or service, you want to add all the possible features available instead of kind of narrowing it down to actually the ones that solve the people that will be using its kind of goals and objectives. The next heuristic I kind of point out is actually a cognitive bias known as the peak-in rule. And the peak-in rule states that people judge an experience largely based on how they felt at its peak and at its end, rather than the sum or average of the entire experience. And this is kind of counter to what you would think, right? If you would think if someone was, say, for example, visiting an e-commerce store or even a physical store, and would go through the experience of talking to personnel at the store, getting help, picking out what they want, checking out, and kind of rating that experience, you would assume that they're kind of averaging the entirety of the experience. And And that's actually not the way our minds work. We actually average these emotional peaks and then the ending experience to kind of determine whether or not it would be something we would recommend to others or repeat, return to that particular store or whatever the experience might be. The peak end role was kind of established by Daniel Kahneman and some of his associates through a study called When More Pain is Preferred to Less. And it's really interesting because they split these participants in the study into two groups. And the first group would hold their hand in water, relatively cold water, for 60 seconds. The second group would hold their hand in the same temperature water for the same amount of time, but then put their hand in slightly warmer water for 30 seconds, for an additional 30 seconds. And what Daniel Kahneman found was that it was actually the second group, trial 2, who had actually had their hand in the water longer, rated the experience as more pleasurable. And what he realized through kind of repeating this study and replicating it in different ways, found that it was really this emotional peak of moving their hand into the new temperature water, and then the ending of the experience being slightly more pleasurable is what people were kind of averaging in their mind and reflecting on when they said that they were more likely to repeat trial 2. When you think about peak enroll and you apply that to the digital space, there's all kinds of really great examples out there. I think some of my favorite that I really point out in the book is, for example, MailChimp. And if you've ever had to put together a newsletter, you'll kind of understand why. It can be a stressful experience, especially if you have to send it off to a lot of people. You're going to worry about spelling errors or faulty information. You're going to be worried about a lot of different things. And so that moment of about when you're ready to send that newsletter out to your group, it can be kind of stressful. And MailChimp does a really good job of kind of injecting a little bit of their brand personality at that key moment. So you'll see the finger that's hovering over the button. This is actually their MailChimp Freddy, the chimpanzee. And he's really funny because he'll start to kind of sweat the longer you wait, and you'll see the sweat animate down his hand. And they're just kind of reinforcing this kind of moment where they understand how stressful this can be. And they kind of help to, validate that through this kind of like animation that they're using. And then once you hit send the actual newsletter, you'll see in the top right example, Freddie gives you a high five. And so they're celebrating with you at this point. You've sent the email, it's time to relax. You can high five Freddie, right? And then they even introduce a little bit of an Easter egg into this experience, because you can click on Eddie's hand and repetitively, give him a high five until, in fact, his hand gets red and he doesn't want to high five anymore. This is just a great example of MailChimp using their brand to really capitalize on the end of this experience and really kind of celebrate with you and introduce a little bit of an Easter egg. And then, of course, last but not least, in the bottom right corner is, this is actually from Uber Express Pull app. And, the researchers and, engineers at Uber have done just an excellent job of putting out some really, first-class products in terms of their applications. And one of the things that I think they really identified as a pain point in the process of, using their service was waiting on their actual, users waiting in their actual vehicle, their ride to arrive. What they realized is that there was a few metrics that they could really hone in on. For example, the goal gradient effect, and kind of use this moment of waiting to kind of incrementally give the user updates on how close their vehicle is to being at their location, entertaining them with a little bit of animation, and even kind of having some operational transparency by showing the participant, if they wish, who their driver is, more information about him or her, more information about their vehicle, and really just kind of adding more content that allows for people to not only have a look under the hood and see what really is happening, but also be entertained a bit during this process of waiting. And what they found was that it was significantly helped to improve that pain point in the experience of waiting on their ride. And as I said before, I really try to tie in relevant user experience exercises in relation to each heuristic, or in the case of peek-in rule, cognitive bias. And for peek-in rule, I talk a little bit about journey mapping, which is really invaluable for technologists because it helps us to visualize how people use a product or service through this narrative of accomplishing a specific task or goal. Really, the power of journey mapping is that you can see from beginning to end in a visual format, not only what the phases or steps that the user needed to undergo to achieve a task, but also kind of their mental state or thought during that. And this is valuable in terms of peek-in role because you can start to see what those emotional peaks are. It could be an emotional positive peak, or it could be an emotional negative peak. And it's those emotional negative peaks that you want to correct, because those are the ones that the users are most likely to remember. That, and then the ending of the experience, if peek-in rule provides guidance. Another heuristic I really want to talk about is actually known in psychology as a law. It's called Hick's law. And what it states is that the time it takes to make a decision increases with the number and complexity of choices available. I put this at the beginning of the book because I think it's very important for people to understand, people that are building technology, to understand that human beings, we don't think or operate like machines, right? People, they have a mental capacity that's limited. And you can even kind of correlate to actual computers in a way. So, these particular graphics that I include in relation to Hick's law in the book, the top one is a visualization of how the increase in choices makes the reaction time or decision time go up proportionally. And also that when it comes to kind of making decisions, it's important for technologists to remember that people are not always solely focused on their goal. They might be kind of juggling if it's buying a product, they might be trying to compare mentally the product pricing or features. They might have something else on their mind, or they might be slightly distracted. And so this working memory buffer graphic that I include below really is just there to highlight that, people are not always kind of, solely focused on achieving their goal. They're kind of juggling multiple things. And the more decisions, the more kind of cognitive load that you're forcing people to kind of take on, it increases the likelihood of them kind of dropping off at certain points, or becoming more frustrated and reducing their capacity to kind of think through a problem and find the information they need on a product or within a service. There's some really fantastic examples of Hick's law all over the place, but one of my favorites by far is these memes that you can find all over the internet regarding remotes. I call them in the book grandparents remotes, because many of us might have been asked by our grandmother, grandfather to help them kind of find that particular channel on their television. And some particularly clever folks out there have actually went through the work of taping off non-relevant options on the remotes and only leaving the ones that were relevant to left exposed. And even on the right, you can see that they have went through the trouble of actually putting the station channel number on the actual remote itself, and then having signifiers of on, off, and undo written on the actual remote. This is a good example of Hick's law, because it really kind of highlights that oftentimes, these universal remotes are just have so many options that even those that know what buttons do what, it can take a moment to kind of process where that button is on the remote. Another great example in the digital space of seeing Hick's law in action is the large example on the right is actually from Slack. And this is highlighting Slack's onboarding experience, which is a key moment in any product or service, because onboarding is that moment where people are learning how to use the tool. And quite often, the way they learn how to do something or not learn how to do something will determine how useful that tool is for them and how likely they're to continue using it. Slack does something really interesting called progressive onboarding, where they kind of walk you through step by step using their service by actually doing. So you actually type in to the field, into the message field in response to a bot that is there to kind of help you learn the tool by using it. And they also limit the features that are available until you went through these steps to kind of learn the core functionality of Slack before they kind of make those available to you, which I think is very clever. Another good example of this is Google search, which has remained largely unchanged for a long time. And I think there's a good reason for that. When you go to look for something, you have a keyword or something in mind that you're going to search for. And it's not until you've actually typed in that keyword that they give you all these filtering and options for further drilling down and finding what you need. So instead of inundating you with search by images, search by videos, search by news, Google search is asking you to do is search by keyword. And then once you've done that, they're going to kind of open up these additional options for you. They're going to reduce, what they're doing here is basically reducing the cognitive load that it takes to kind of get in there and start trying to find what you need right away. And then they kind of ease you into these kind of more additional features or options for finding specific information. And of course, relating this back to, a user experience exercise that could be valuable in relation to Hick's law is card sorting, which is great for figuring out how items should be organized according to people's kind of mental models of what this information is. And having, really it works by having participants organize topics within groups that make the most sense to them. As a designer, I would say that this is a very useful exercise, because I can start to kind of see how people are thinking about very specific groupings of content and how they would categorize it mentally. And this gives me a glimpse into the mental model they're thinking in terms of how they would look for something given the task of looking for that on a product or service. A book about psychology and how that kind of intersects with this, the role or the work we do as technologists, it wouldn't be right to write a book like this without talking about kind of some of the ethical responsibilities I think that come with it. It's important that we consider how products and services have the potential to undermine the goals of the people using them. I start off this chapter by talking about the Skinner box, which some of you may be familiar with, but also known as the operant conditioning chamber. This was used by B.F. Skinner in the 1950s, 60s, and really what he was doing was experimenting on animals to kind of see if he could shape their behavior through very specific stimulus and response loops. So by turning on a light within the chamber, conditioning them to pull a lever that would then dispense food for them. And what Skinner found was very interesting. He found that if he actually dispensed different amounts of food and water each time the lever was pulled, it was more likely to kind of condition the animal to repetitively pull the lever. Much more so than if it was the same amount of food each and every time they pulled the lever. Now, when you think about this, in psychology, this is known as behavioral psychology. it has all kinds of application to the digital space, some of which are very, very, explicit. So on the left, you see that this is actually an example of Twitter's pull down to refresh, where you can pull down on a feed to refresh and get new content. And it's by no coincidence that this feels very much like pulling a lever on a slot machine, for example, because you are getting a different amount of content each and every time you pull down to refresh Twitter. That could be a photo that you're tagged in, that could be posts from people that you follow, or that could be absolutely nothing at all. There's no updates. So it starts to shape behavior because, this becomes a little bit of a repetitive kind of motion of refreshing an application, almost kind of like, an impulse reaction within the application. Another good example of this is the autoplay that you can see in things like Netflix or YouTube. And the top right example is actually from YouTube, where they start to autoplay the next video instead of kind of recommending a next video and you having to explicitly select to play that video. And this is really interesting because it kind of hones in on human beings' kind of tendency to kind of take the path of least resistance quite often. And that autoplay ends up easily becoming a little bit of a tunnel, a rabbit hole, if you will. And I know me personally, I've binge watched many an episode on Netflix because of this specific user experience pattern of autoplaying the next video. And I highlight that in this chapter related to ethics because I think that this is a good example of when a feature that's really there for convenience and removing the friction of having to select to, play the next video could actually be detrimental to your goals as a user. Maybe you were going to YouTube or Netflix to see something very specific. Next thing you know, you're, 4 hours into a binge session and, you haven't really achieved the objective that you were after. And the bottom right example is actually, of course, from Facebook. It's the ubiquitous like button, which I think is also another great example of maybe a feature that was introduced to kind of, in the case of Facebook, add more joy to the platform. But what it did was actually, create this kind of, self-affirmation model within social networks or social platforms, which has been kind of replicated in some form or fashion, whether you're talking about Instagram or LinkedIn or Twitter or in this case, Facebook. And I think it really hones in on human beings' kind of need for self-affirmation and approval from their peers. And this, of course, can be also kind of undermining because people could start to kind of share content for all the wrong reasons. I point out a few things in the book. Obviously, Laws of UX started off as a project where I realized I didn't have a lot of the quantitative data that I needed to make a lot of great design decisions I needed to make. But I realized that quantitative data tells us a lot of useful things, such as how quickly people are performing tasks, or what they're looking for and how they are interacting with the system, right? So it tells us those very kind of metric-centric, behavioral items that we need to know about. What it doesn't actually tell us, though, is that why people are behaving in certain ways or how the product is actually impacting their lives. And I think one thing that's been really interesting for me throughout the kind of process of, curating and building Laws of UX is that this realization that quantitative data doesn't really replace this need to actually talk and observe people and how they're actually using products and services and really getting this glimpse into how it's impacting their lives. And of course, last but not least, how these kind of cognitive or psychology principles can be applied to design. As designers or technologists in general, we can internalize and apply psychology principles and then articulate them through design principles. And I really kind of highlight on a few things that I think are really effective when it comes to really integrating this into your everyday workflow. A few examples here. One thing, the two images on the left come from, people printing out the posters that I've given, made available for free on laws of UX and putting them in their offices. And I absolutely love seeing this because it really signifies to me that people are not only kind of embracing this idea of psychology being so important to user experience, but also seeing these posters and knowing that they're sparking conversation amongst designers and developers and data analysis and biz dev people and project managers and UX designers. Like they're all seeing these and they're articulating these in their design critiques or their product critiques. And for me, it's been one of the most exciting things to see about the project. The other thing that I point out in the book is a little bit more of an integrated way to introduce these principles into your workflow, and that's through design principles. I point out a few examples, but this is one that I'll kind of talk about here, and it's take, for example, a design principle, which is really just kind of an agreed upon value that the team is aligned on. And by team, I mean everyone: designers, developers, project managers, leadership. Everyone is aligned on these are the things, these are the values that we have when building our product or service. So first of identifying that, and then once that's done, laddering that up to a relevant heuristic or cognitive bias from psychology. So this example states that clarity over abundance of choice is the value. And that's directly kind of related to Hick's law, which we know the time it takes to make a decision increases with the number and complexity of choices. So it's really about being very clear and explicit on the choices that you make available instead of giving people all the options all the time. And then finally, kind of relating that back to very explicit rules that you can set that ladder up to this principle, right? So in the case of clarity over abundance of choice, to achieve that, we must limit choices to no more than 3 items at a time. And this is a kind of arbitrary number, but you see the point. It's to really kind of limit how many options people have at any given moment to kind of reduce that cognitive load. And then finally, provide brief explanations where useful so that things are more clear and that they're within a very explicit character range, right? So you're giving a quantitative value to this rule that ladders back up to the heuristic or law, Hick's law in this case. So I kind of given you a high-level overview of the book, and really, kind of walked you through the structure of each chapter and kind of what I've tried to really kind of accomplish with this book. And really, I think that again, it's really about making psychology and how that intersects with technology just a lot more accessible to people that don't necessarily have the psychology background. And really kind of work as a guide or an introduction into this kind of very rich intersection of psychology and design. Thank you.
Thanks, Jon. So if anyone has any questions, please type them in the chat and I'll moderate them. So to start off, I guess I had a question for you. Maybe you did hit this a little bit, but so which laws do you see applying to data science and data visualization? I went through your list and, I found a couple that seem relevant, such as like Miller's Law and maybe like law of proximity, and, data visualization and data journalism is a important thing. So do you work with any of those folks, or do you have any thoughts on that?
So yeah, I do. I definitely. I don't work directly with a lot of data visualists or data visualization personally, but I think that it's definitely part of a complex product. Like, as you can imagine, like for example, a vehicle, there's a lot of data involved in both the kind of design of the vehicle and then also the kind of user experience within the vehicle, and even the kind of application that supports the user experience outside of the vehicle. So I think there's a few that come to mind. One is Tesla's law, which really kind of talks about, any given product or experience is going to have a certain amount of complexity. And when I say complexity, I'm thinking about data in a lot of ways, because you have to manage that complexity in a certain kind of way. And that inevitably comes in the form of data a lot of times. And it's really about how, where you manage that data. Is it kind of passed on to the end user experience, or is that gonna kind of be absorbed into the developer experience and kind of accounted for by kind of abstracting away a lot of complexity for the user. So that's one that I think about, and it's actually a really important chapter in the book, I think. And then Miller's law is really interesting too. I think that there's always been a misnomer about Miller's law that I try to highlight in the book, and it's that this kind of artificial limit on numbers of items has always been something that I think has been grossly kind of misunderstood about Miller's law. And I think really the valuable thing coming out of Miller's law is that this idea of chunking content. And so I really kind of focus on the psychology concept of chunking and how it relates to design. Really, that's about grouping related data, related content, related information in these more discernible chunks of information that make them a lot more glanceable and digestible for people.
Yeah, actually, I was wondering, kind of related, I know you're working at General Motors and doing some in-vehicle work. Can you talk anything about that, like some of the problems that you're encountering, or do you work with like data scientists or like work with different types of engineers? I'm just curious to like what that kind of work is.
Yeah, I can't provide too much information regarding some of that.
Sure.
But, I think that one of the things that's been amazing working in an organization as large as GM is that your access to all kinds of different disciplines, so working really closely with developers and human factors engineers and mechanical engineers and electrical engineers and, folks, really focused on data science and things like this. It all kind of converges, and it's all kind of there, and you kind of get a glimpse into all of these different disciplines in the same kind of space, which is, for me, it's been eye-opening. I think I've learned a lot. I've actually learned probably the most from human factors engineers, personally, simply because they really kind of can quantify a user experience in terms of by simply observation and task-based kind of analysis, and then use that kind of data that comes from that to really inform the way people are actually interacting with the designs that we're making. So, I could work in a vacuum all day and create interfaces that I think will be, effective or cool or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's the human factors engineers that come back to me with data saying, this is actually what we're observing. And it helps to really kind of inform, the product in a more positive way, a more human-centered way, really.
So there was a couple of questions about some of the things that you said. So with the Daniel Kahneman trials, did he do it in reverse, where he did the first 30 seconds warmer and then the last colder, or did he?
Oh, that would be interesting. Not that I've read. I did read, and I've seen studies that he did that really kind of switched up the water, hand in water to being things like colonoscopies and actually leaving in the tools within the patient longer. And so it's these variations of the same study. Where he would see the same results, but no, never the reverse, which it would be actually really interesting.
Yeah.
I would imagine you'd see a lot of the same, where you'd see the same data coming out of that, because really, I think what Daniel Kahneman honed in on with the peak-in rule was that it's really not about, it's really about that emotional peak and that ending. and then like how, if it starts off a little bit more pleasant and ends, slightly unpleasant, I'd be really curious to see how that would change the results of the study. It might actually do the actual opposite, now that I think about it.
Yeah. And then there was a question about with Hick's law, does that specify a rate at which the time to make a decision increases with the number of choices?
Yeah, there's a formula, a formula that I had not memorized, but I do kind of, put in the book. It's a mathematical formula that he really kind of honed in on it and was able to kind of formulate. But it's really about, response time in relation to, a number of kind of stimuli available, and how that, proportionally affects the kind of response time, or in the case of digital products, quite often it's decision making.
Sorry, I'm trying to go over some of the questions. So I guess what you have all those laws, are they kind of in order? I mean, do you feel that there's certain laws that are more important or ones to focus on more in design?
Yeah, I do. There is somewhat of an order to them, or a kind of a thoughtful order of them. I start off with law for a very good reason. I mean, I think one of the first things to really that it's important to understand when it comes to psychology and how that kind of overlaps with technology is this idea of mental models. And really the underlying kind of goal of the book is about designing and building technology that really adapts to human beings, and not so much forcing human beings to kind of conform to the actual, tool or service. Jacob's law, important one to kind of start off with there, because it states that whatever you're building and putting out there into the digital space, it needs to contend with what people are bringing into it mentally. So what their mental kind of map looks like for your product and service and how it should work. So I start off with Jacob's law for that explicit reason. Yeah, and then like Hick's law and Fitts law even. Fitts law is actually states that it talks about really how quick it is to acquire a target, based on its kind of vicinity within an interface. And I think that I start those off because they're very fundamental to this kind of overlap of psychology and design, right? It's mental models and reaction time and cognitive load. These are all really core to core concepts that I'm using really the laws like Hick's law and all that. It's really vehicles for laddering back and talking about these core psychology concepts like chunking or mental models.
So that was good. More of a question about designing applications. So there was a question about, in the course of designing applications, sometimes you move towards automating some of the things for the users and kind of hiding it away. And do you have a view, is that doing more harm than good? And really the question was that the member was saying that he's struggling to find a balance of treating his users like adults without overloading them with the new buttons, dials, or extra homework to do. And so really, I think that applies a lot to different things. But I know in the work that we do, we work with a lot of analysts and trying to automate the work that the analyst is doing. Are you really hurting them by taking away, things for them? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, this is the kind of classic balance of what you do with the complexity of an application. Like, so the more automation or, removal of friction that you make, the more complexity that you're kind of abstracting away from people. But it also kind of, there's a downside to that, because that complexity has to go somewhere. I kind of mentioned that earlier in relation to Tesla's law, but it's really about finding that balance where there's enough power for people where they need it, but then automating the things that are redundant or repetitive as much as possible. One of the examples I point out in the book is, Gmail, which has always been really great about, kind of smart auto hints within their, within the application. So these kind of responses that are really kind of being built from AI that's looking at how you're, it's looking at the email, it's looking at the subject, it's looking at the recipient of the email, and kind of smartly suggesting email, lines of text that would really help to kind of automate the process of creating an email. And this is just one of those examples that is very, very convenient, but there's a downside to that in that you get these very canned responses in Gmail that sound very generic. It sounds like a computer that's typed out the email itself. So there is a gotcha there, and I think that finding this balance where you can remove some of that kind of friction and automate as much as possible without really kind of creating technology that it sounds very generic, and it takes the human element out of things. And that's really the balance that we have to strike.
So I had a question, just because I'm not a UX engineer and I'm only vaguely familiar with some of the concepts, but when I initially think about UX, it's more of like a web page or application, but we're becoming a lot of different, phones and voice and things like that. Do you find that the laws apply to those kind of, like, designing an application for Alexa? Do you still deal with the same constraints? Do the laws still apply, or do you find that it's only a subset of the laws apply to certain mediums, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So there is definitely, we're hardwired to kind of interact with technology very specifically. Like our programming has remained relatively the same for a really, really long time, yet the technology that we're interacting with kind of changes pretty rapidly. But I think the underlying kind of strength in these heuristics and laws that they're really kind of, related to how we're processing the world around us. And that's really technology agnostic in a lot of ways. And there's exceptions to that. I mean, I think about Fitts law, where it's really about how the time to acquire a target. That really is relevant for the digital space and like touch interaction and things like that. But when you think about that in relation to voice, it's not really as relevant. Voice is actually a really interesting like interaction input because it doesn't rely on physical interaction. It's more auditory, So some apply, I think, more so than others, but they definitely they're timeless in that they're kind of built in response to kind of from observation of how humans actually interact and behave with the world around us.
Just a few more, John. I think they're pretty quick. The one was, some of these concepts are hard to get buy-in from management and customers. I mean, do you have any experience or suggestions of how you do that?
So I want to make sure I understand the question. So how would these laws be applied to like more of a management role or something like that?
I think it's more of, I think the question is, as designers, it's sometimes hard maybe to get customers to be open to some of these changes or some of the suggestions, or to get management to be open to how you're going to design or change some of the applications to adhere to some of these laws. Like, do you have any tricks to get people, I guess, in those positions that aren't UX engineers to understand some of the principles that you're outlining in these, books? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways to tackle this. One is that, I think it's important to note here is that, these psychology understandings from psychology are great and they're very valuable, and they can get us a long way. They don't actually replace just straight up great, quantitative and qualitative data on how people are actually behaving with a product or service. So they're not a replacement for that. They're really meant to kind of, reinforce and validate those findings, right? And the other thing is that really it's about not arbitrarily kind of referencing these within your organization, but really kind of tying them in really closely with the things that you value as a team that's building technology. And that's, that last chapter that I talk about how application framework and how to apply these principles, that's an important one because it's really about first identifying what are the things that we'll value as a team when we build technology, and then using these kind of findings from psychology to really kind of ladder up to some of those items to kind of help really, at the end of the day, drive decision making. So, I think that's what's really important and what is really valuable, especially for people more in management roles and folks that are outside of the immediate kind of pool of those that are actually building the technology, but maybe those that are managing those that are building the technology. These principles kind of are an entryway into understanding this is the creation process from a design, development, data standpoint. These are the values that we align to. Here's the psychology kind of concepts that relate to the decision making that we'll make, and then everyone's kind of aligned on the same kind of decision making framework. And I think that's that's the most effective way to go about kind of not only kind of being a proponent for psychology and how that integrates with technology, but also then operationalizing it into the day-to-day decision making.
Awesome. All right, so just to wrap up, it's the fun questions, the easier questions. So I'll just put them all together.
Okay.
Who inspires you, or like what resources are you looking at? Other than your books, of course, that everyone should check out, but do you have things that you would suggest? And then, someone that's kind of new to UX or just getting started, do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the most valuable resources on the web when it comes to really psychology and how it overlaps with user experiences, the work that's been done by the Norman Nielsen Group. So Norman Nielsen Group, I forget the URL, but their blog online is just really invaluable when it comes to research that is really kind of coming from the more academic or more scientific kind of spaces, and then translating that really directly into the digital space. I think that they've been a pioneer in that regard. So both Don Norman in his book, The Design of Everyday Things, the absolute classic when it comes to human-centered design. And then, of course, Jakob Nielsen in his work as well has been absolutely invaluable. The other, I think, is Daniel Kahneman, who is just an absolute psychology juggernaut, right? And his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, I think is a foundational kind of, book when it comes to psychology in the kind of modern sense, but then, and he doesn't really talk too directly into how that applies to technology, but you can read between the lines because he really kind of dives into this concept of cognitive biases, which I think are really important, really interesting to kind of understand. It kind of gets into the more behavioral kind of psychology, and its implications are just, when it comes to technology, are just really deep. So those are two really great resources that I think are great out there. And then, the other is just like seeing the work that teams are doing. And that, these teams that are building products like the Uber example I gave earlier, where you just got this really great collaboration of data scientists and UX researchers and UX designers and developers coming together to really kind of iterate on a product and make it as good as possible, and thankfully a lot of people are putting their case studies out there in the world so we can learn from those. And it's just another really great source of inspiration is seeing, some of that work that's being done on products like Uber, products like Netflix, actually, they do a really great job as well. And, I'm sure there's many examples out there that we don't see because they're more kind of B2B or more kind of NDA kind of situations. But yeah, I mean, I love reading case studies that people are putting out there right now.
Yeah, so then, the last question is, where do you think someone should start? I mean, do you have any quick hints for people trying to get more into UX and learn more?
I would point anyone to the Norman Nelson group blog, because they've been doing such a fantastic job for such a long time. And, it's the challenge on the web, I think, is really finding credible sources. And I think, Don Norman, it doesn't get more credible than that, in my opinion. He kind of just coined this whole idea of human-centered design around, the kind of, from an actual event, the 3 Mile Island disaster. And he was able to kind of, pivot from psychology into the digital space by kind of identifying what were the root causes of the 3 Mile Island accident. And I just think, it's really, the work he's done is foundational. Anyone that wanted to get started kind of learning more, that would be just an excellent kind of entryway.
Yeah, I mean, so just to follow up on that, one last question, John. As with anything data science or data science, analytics, software, everything there's always that barrier of entry, I think, that folks get intimidated by, right? Or it gets a little challenging, not maybe intimidating. So, with Coursera and things like that, I mean, do you have any suggestions on someone to gain experience to start a career? Any hints? And, I think, and just to give you an example, I think sometimes with like data science, folks recommend, coming in, picking your discipline or taking Coursera courses or offering to do, or coming from the side from like software development. So anything like that, would be appreciative.
Yeah. I think that there's no substitute for just pure passion for something. I mean, my whole thing has always been, I went to an art school. I don't have a computer science degree. I have a bachelor in fine arts, right? And I kind of found my way through graphic design into user experience gradually. And then just through hard work and doing side project. If I couldn't really get the experience I was trying to get in my day job, doing a side project that would experiment with that, and that's driven largely by the passion to learn. And so if there's something that you're trying to learn and you're excited about it and you're continually following that path, I really think you're not going to go wrong there. You're going to be doing something that you love to be doing that engages you, and it pushes you to kind of go further, keep learning, and really just continue to kind of build on, your past experiences.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, I was just thinking about it. I know, we've been trying to see if we can do like a side study group to get people, and, we're trying to get it up. But I know there's some area groups in Maryland that are doing like civic data. And I think I'm always looking for, and, hackathons where people can come in at all skill levels and try to bring, learn there. And I think that might be something that people should think about, at least some of the civic data groups in Maryland, where they're trying to do some products and doing some things on the side and volunteer basis. So
yeah.
That's it, John. I mean, I think you did a great job. I think you have some amazing things out there, your web pages, the resources. I really appreciate your time. I apologize for the technical difficulties and the delayed start. I will try to get this posted to YouTube because that kind of was disappointing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, thank you. Awesome job. And if you ever need anything, let me know. And thank you, everyone, for joining in, staying with us, and being patient throughout. If you need to send anything to me, just let me know. John, is your slides, would you be willing to share those, or are they available?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll follow up and send them your way.
Cool. All right. Well, I hope everyone has a nice weekend and stay safe. Thank you, John. See you guys. Have a good one.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, man. Bye.